I never thought a breadbasket could hold so much betrayal. But there I was, sitting alone at Romano's Italian Bistro in Phoenix, watching my family drive away through the floor-to-ceiling windows while our appetizers grew cold on the table. The waiter kept refilling my water glass with pitying glances, probably wondering why a 72-year-old woman was dining alone on a Tuesday evening when she'd clearly been expecting company. What he didn't know was that in the next hour, I would quietly pull out my phone and change my entire will from that very table, redistributing everything I'd spent a lifetime building. They left me there like I was nothing. So I made sure that's exactly what they'd inherit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Kate Morrison, and for 72 years I thought I understood what family meant. I was born and raised in Phoenix, back when the city was still more desert than subdivision, when you could drive for miles without seeing a strip mall or a Starbucks. I met my husband Robert at a church social when I was 23. He was wearing a bolo tie and boots that were too big for him, trying to impress some girl near the punch bowl. I laughed at his awkward charm, and somehow that laugh caught his attention more than any batting eyelash ever could. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at the old Methodist church on Central Avenue. Nothing fancy, nothing elaborate. Just two people who'd found something real in a world that was already starting to spin too fast. Robert worked construction, building the houses that would eventually transform Phoenix from a sleepy desert town into the sprawling metropolis it became. I worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's coffee order and we still used carbon paper for receipts. We saved every penny we could, not because we were misers, but because we'd both grown up with nothing and understood the weight of security. Robert would come home with dust in his hair and concrete under his fingernails, and I'd have dinner waiting. We'd sit on our small back patio, watching the sunset behind the mountains, planning for a future we hoped would be bigger than our present. We wanted children, a house with more than 2 bedrooms, maybe even a little land where Robert could try his hand at growing something other than calluses. It took us 6 years to save enough for the down payment on our dream house. A ranch-style home in what was then considered the outskirts of Phoenix, with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a backyard big enough for the children we hoped to fill it with. The desert stretched behind our property line, endless and beautiful, dotted with saguaro cacti that stood like ancient sentinels against the Arizona sky. Robert planted a small garden in defiance of the harsh climate, coaxing tomatoes and peppers from soil that had never seen such ambition. Our son Michael arrived 3 years later, after we'd almost given up hope. I remember holding him for the first time in the hospital, this tiny miracle with Robert's stubborn chin and my dark eyes. Robert cried, actually cried, when the nurse placed Michael in his arms. We'd waited so long for this moment that it felt almost too precious to be real. I think that's where we made our first mistake, though we didn't know it then. We loved that boy so fiercely, so completely, that we forgot to teach him the value of the sacrifices we made to give him everything we'd never had. Michael grew up, comfortable in ways Robert and I never were. He had his own bedroom, his own bicycle, toys that weren't hand-me-downs or homemade. When he wanted to join Little League, we paid the fees without question, even though it meant eating beans and rice for a month. When he needed a car for high school, Robert worked overtime for 6 months to afford a used pickup truck that Michael promptly took for granted. We told ourselves we were good parents, giving our child opportunities we'd never had. We didn't realize we were also giving him the dangerous assumption that good things simply appeared without effort or appreciation. Robert had always been healthy, strong as the buildings he helped construct. So when he started getting tired in the evenings, when climbing the stairs left him breathless, we blamed it on age and the Arizona heat. By the time we realized something was seriously wrong, the cancer had already spread too far for the doctors to chase it with any real hope. He died on a Thursday morning in March, 6 days after his 68th birthday, holding my hand and apologizing for leaving me with so much unfinished business. The grief was like a second desert, vast and unforgiving, where nothing grew and every step forward felt impossible. But grief, I learned, doesn't pause for practical matters. There were insurance claims to file, accounts to transfer, legal documents to update. Michael helped in his way, but he was 35 years old, with a wife and his own concerns. He'd moved to Tucson after college and built a life there that didn't include much room for his aging mother, except during holidays and family emergencies. That's when I discovered exactly how much Robert and I had accumulated over 4 decades of careful living. The house was paid off. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversations always followed the same pattern. They'd ask about my week, listen politely to my answers, then transition into concerns about my isolation, my safety, my long-term planning. They'd present their suggestions as caring questions. Had I thought about what would happen if I fell? Did I realize how much work the house required? Wouldn't it be nice to have people around, activities to join, medical care nearby? They never pressured directly, never demanded answers, but they created a steady drumbeat of worry that made my contentment feel selfish and my independence seem dangerous. I started dreading the dinners even as I continued to need them. They were my primary connection to family, my only regular social contact, but they'd become performances where I had to defend choices I'd never questioned and justify a life that had always felt sufficient until they suggested it wasn't. I found myself agreeing to considerations I had no intention of pursuing, nodding along with suggestions that felt like gentle coercion, smiling through conversations that left me feeling diminished and dismissed. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in October, one of those perfect Arizona nights when the temperature finally drops below 80 and the desert air carries the promise of cooler days ahead. I'd been looking forward to dinner all week, had even bought a new blouse in a shade of blue that Robert always said brought out my eyes. I arrived at Romano's early, as I always did, and settled into our usual booth with a book and a glass of water. Michael and Sarah arrived 20 minutes late, hurried and distracted, Sarah clutching a folder thick with papers. They apologized for the delay, blamed traffic and work obligations, ordered their usual drinks without looking at the menu. The conversation started normally enough. Updates about their jobs, questions about my week, the comfortable small talk that had become our family ritual. But something was different that night. They kept exchanging glances, little looks that suggested they'd rehearsed what came next. Michael cleared his throat and said they'd been doing some research, that they'd found something they thought I should consider. Sarah opened her folder and pulled out a glossy brochure for Sunset Manor, a continuing care retirement community in Scottsdale with golf courses and art studios and what they called a vibrant social environment. They'd already scheduled a tour for the following week. They'd put my name on a waiting list. They'd spoken with the financial counselor about payment options and had determined that selling the house would provide more than enough to cover the entrance fee and monthly costs, with plenty left over for emergencies or extras. They presented this as an opportunity, a chance for me to explore options, but their planning had already progressed far beyond exploration. I sat there listening to them describe the future they'd arranged for me, watching Sarah point to photographs of smiling seniors playing bridge and painting watercolors and exercising in an indoor pool. They talked about the relief it would bring them, knowing I was safe and supervised, surrounded by peers and professionals trained to handle any emergency that might arise. They painted pictures of freedom, of adventure, of a life unencumbered by the responsibilities of home ownership. What they didn't mention was choice. What they didn't ask was whether this vision of my future aligned with my own dreams or preferences or plans. They presented Sunset Manor as the logical next step, the responsible decision, the choice any reasonable person in my situation would make. They talked about me as if I were a problem they'd solved, rather than a person whose input might be relevant to decisions about her own life. I tried to participate in the conversation, to ask questions about costs and timelines and what would happen to Robert's tools in the garage, his garden that I still tended every morning, the life we'd built in, a house that held 40 years of memories. But my questions were dismissed as details to be worked out later, complications that could be handled by professionals, attachments that would seem less important once I experienced the benefits of community living. The dinner continued around me while I retreated into a kind of shocked silence. They ordered appetizers and entrees, discussed plans for Thanksgiving, debated whether to see a movie after dinner. Normal conversation, family conversation, as if they hadn't just announced their intention to dismantle my life and relocate me to an institution I'd never expressed interest in joining. They assumed my consent, took for granted my compliance, treated my future as a decision they were qualified to make on my behalf. When the check arrived, Michael reached for his wallet with the casual confidence of someone who'd just handled an unpleasant but necessary task. Sarah smiled at me with the satisfied expression of someone who'd solved a difficult problem. They talked about calling the retirement community in the morning, about scheduling the tour, about beginning the process of listing the house with a realtor Sarah had already researched. That's when I realized they weren't asking for my opinion. They were informing me of their decision. This dinner wasn't a conversation about my future. It was a notification that my future had already been determined, that my role was simply to cooperate with plans they'd made without my input or consent. They'd reduced me to a problem requiring management rather than a person deserving respect. I excused myself to use the restroom, but instead, I stood in the narrow hallway near the back of the restaurant, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. Through the doorway, I could see Michael and Sarah at our table, heads bent together over the retirement community brochure, pointing at features and nodding with satisfaction. They looked like people who'd just made a good investment, who'd solved a complicated problem through careful research and planning. When I returned to the table, they were ready to leave. We had retirement accounts, savings, a small investment portfolio that Robert had managed with the same methodical care he'd applied to everything else. There was life insurance, enough to ensure I'd never have to worry about money if I was careful. By Arizona standards, we weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We were secure. We were the kind of people who'd done everything right, saved for retirement, paid our taxes, never lived beyond our means. Michael seemed surprised by the numbers when I showed him the financial statements. Not pleased exactly, but surprised, as if he'd never really considered that his blue-collar parents might have been better at building wealth than his white-collar friends. He made suggestions about investments, about ways to make the money grow faster. He talked about market opportunities and retirement communities with the casual confidence of someone who'd never actually managed money through a recession or a medical crisis. I listened politely, but I'd been managing our finances since before Michael learned to count. I understood compound interest and risk tolerance, and the difference between want and need. What I was beginning to understand was that Michael saw my inheritance not as my security, but as his eventual windfall. Nothing he said directly, nothing I could point to as proof. Just a subtle shift in how he talked about the future, about his plans, about what I might need versus what I might want to leave behind. Michael had married Sarah 3 years before. Robert died. She was nice enough, a teacher from Tucson with practical shoes and strong opinions about organic food. She called me Mom from the beginning, which felt forced but well-intentioned. They visited for holidays, sometimes for a long weekend, always with careful attention to splitting time between her parents and me. Fair, I suppose, but fairness in families often feels more like bookkeeping than love. After Robert died, their visits became more frequent but somehow less comfortable. They'd arrive with suggestions about downsizing, about simplifying my life, about communities for active seniors where I could make friends and stay busy. They talked about the burden of maintaining a large house, about the isolation of living, alone about the worry they carried for my safety and well-being. All reasonable concerns, all delivered with genuine care, but underneath their words I heard something else. I heard them planning my life around their convenience. They started bringing real estate brochures, printed information about retirement, communities with names like Desert Springs and Golden Vista, places with golf courses and activity centers and medical facilities right on campus. They painted pictures of a social life I'd never wanted, of organized activities and scheduled meals and the kind of enforced cheerfulness that makes loneliness feel like a moral failing. They meant well, I think, but they were solving problems I didn't have while ignoring the one thing I actually needed, which was simply to be seen and heard in the decisions being made about my life. The real shift came gradually, so slowly that I almost didn't notice it until it was complete. Phone calls became less frequent, visits more rushed. When they did come to Phoenix, they spent most of their time looking at the house with calculating eyes, noting what needed repair, what could be updated, what might be valuable to potential buyers. They talked about me as if I weren't there, discussing my future in the third person while I sat in the living room Robert and I had furnished together over 30 years. Sarah started mentioning friends whose parents had made the transition to assisted living. Not because they needed assistance, she was careful to clarify, but because they'd found community and purpose and freedom from the responsibilities of homeownership. She talked about the relief these families felt, knowing their parents were safe and cared for, no longer isolated in houses too big for their needs. She never said I was isolated, never suggested I couldn't care for myself, but the implication hung in the air like humidity. Michael began handling more of my affairs without asking. He set up automatic bill pay for my utilities, arranged for a lawn service, hired a house cleaner to come twice a month. All kind gestures, all presented as ways to make my life easier, but each one removed another piece of my independence, another connection to the daily rhythms that kept me grounded in my own life. I became an observer in my own house, watching strangers maintain the space Robert and I had built while my son managed the money we'd saved. They established a tradition of monthly dinners, always at Romano's Italian Bistro, a restaurant near my house with good lighting and comfortable chairs. Michael said it was easier than cooking, less work for everyone, a chance to catch up without the distractions of home. I looked forward to these dinners at first, grateful for the regular contact, the guarantee that I'd see them at least once a month regardless of how busy their lives became. Romano's became our place, the corner booth where we always sat, the same waitress who knew our orders, the same conversations about work and weather and plans for the upcoming holidays. I began to think of it as family time, sacred in its reliability, proof that distance and busy schedules hadn't completely severed the bonds between us. I dressed carefully for these dinners, chose jewelry that caught the light, wore perfume that reminded me of the woman I'd been when Robert was alive, and the future felt full of possibility. What I didn't realize was that for Michael and Sarah, these dinners had become something else entirely. They were status meetings, progress reports on the project of managing my life. They'd arrive with printed materials, articles about senior health, information about services I might need, suggestions about changes I might consider. They talked about my future as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a life to be lived, as if my preferences were obstacles rather than valid choices made by a competent adult. Michael had paid the check, Sarah had gathered her papers, and they were both reaching for their coats with the satisfied efficiency of people who'd accomplished their goal. They hugged me in the parking lot, promised to call about the tour, reminded me not to worry about anything because they had everything under control. I stood there watching their taillights disappear into the Phoenix traffic, still holding the doggy bag containing the dinner I'd been too shocked to finish. The desert air was cool against my face, and the parking lot was nearly empty, except for my car and a few others belonging to the restaurant staff. I could see our waitress through the window, clearing tables and resetting them for tomorrow's customers. I sat in my car for a long time, not ready to drive home to the house they'd already decided to sell, not ready to face the garden Robert had planted and the rooms we'd furnished together, and the life they'd deemed insufficient for my own well-being. I thought about the retirement community brochure, about the smiling faces in the photographs, about the activities and amenities designed to fill days that had apparently become too empty for me to manage alone. That's when I pulled out my phone and called the one person who'd never treated my independence as a burden or my preferences as obstacles. Mr. Thompson had been our attorney for 20 years, had handled Robert's will and the transfer of assets. After his death, had always treated me as a competent adult capable of making informed decisions about my own life. He answered on the second ring, and his voice was exactly what I needed to hear, professional and respectful and completely free of condescension. I told him I needed to update my will immediately, that circumstances had changed, and I wanted to make some modifications to my estate planning. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't express surprise at the timing or the urgency. He simply said he could meet me at his office in an hour if it was truly important, or we could schedule something for the following day if I preferred to wait. I told him an hour would be perfect, and I drove straight from Romano's parking lot to the office building downtown where Mr. Thompson had been practicing law since before Michael was born. The building was mostly dark except for the security lighting and his office on the third floor, where he was waiting with fresh coffee and the kind of patient attention that made me remember what it felt like to be heard. Mr. Thompson's office felt like sanctuary that night, with its leather chairs and walls lined with law books that had witnessed decades of human drama. He poured me coffee from a pot he'd clearly made just for our meeting, and I found myself grateful for the simple kindness of being treated like someone whose time mattered, whose decisions deserved respect. We spent 2 hours updating my will, making changes that felt both necessary and liberating, though I didn't explain the full context of why everything needed to be different now. When I finally drove home, the house felt smaller somehow, as if the conversation at Romano's had already begun shrinking my world. I walked through rooms that Michael and Sarah had mentally cataloged and priced, touching furniture they'd probably already decided to donate or sell. The bedroom set Robert and I had saved for months to buy, the dining table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, the rocking chair where I'd nursed Michael through childhood fevers. All of it had been reduced to obstacles standing between them and their vision of my simplified future. The phone calls started the next morning. Michael, cheerful and determined, confirming our appointment for the retirement community tour. Sarah, helpful and organized, asking about my preferences for the realtor she'd already contacted. They moved with the efficiency of people implementing a plan they'd clearly been developing for months, maybe years. Every conversation carried the assumption that I was simply the final component to be managed, the last detail to be handled in their careful orchestration of my transition from independence to supervision. I found myself agreeing to meetings I didn't want, nodding through discussions about my future that felt increasingly disconnected from my actual desires or needs. They scheduled the tour at Sunset Manor without asking if the date worked for me. They arranged for the realtor to assess the house without checking if I was ready to consider selling. They talked about timelines and logistics and practical considerations while completely ignoring the emotional reality of dismantling a life I'd spent 40 years building. The retirement community tour was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and Michael picked me up in his SUV with Sarah riding shotgun and a folder of prepared questions on her lap. They were dressed like people attending a business meeting, which I suppose they were, since they'd turned my housing situation into a project requiring professional consultation. I wore my best dress and the pearls Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary, not because I wanted to impress anyone at Sunset Manor, but because I needed to remind myself that I was still a person deserving of dignity and respect. Sunset Manor was exactly what the brochure had promised, a sprawling complex of Southwestern-style buildings arranged around courtyards filled with desert landscaping and walking paths. The marketing director who greeted us was younger than Michael, with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that made everything sound like an opportunity rather than a surrender. She led us through common areas filled with residents playing cards and watching television, and participating in what she called enriching activities designed to promote social engagement and cognitive wellness. The tour felt like a performance, designed to convince me that institutional living was actually a luxury experience, that giving up my independence was really gaining access to services and amenities I'd been missing in my isolated suburban existence. We saw the dining room where meals were served at scheduled times, the activity center where crafts and lectures filled predetermined hours, the medical facility where staff could respond to emergencies and monitor health conditions and ensure that no one ever faced a crisis alone. Michael and Sarah asked detailed questions about costs and contracts and what level of care would be available as my needs changed over time. They discussed my situation as if I weren't standing right beside them, debating whether the independent living units would be sufficient or if I should start in assisted living to avoid another transition later. They talked about the financial advantages of entering the community while I was still healthy enough to enjoy the amenities, about the peace of mind that came with knowing my future care was secured regardless of what health challenges might develop. I listened to them plan my decline with the same methodical attention they'd probably given to choosing their own health insurance or retirement investments. They were solving for problems that might never occur, preparing for dependencies I might never develop, arranging for supervision I certainly didn't want. But their planning felt responsible and caring, and my resistance felt selfish and short-sighted, so I smiled and nodded and let them believe I was considering their suggestions seriously. The apartment they showed me was pleasant enough, a one-bedroom unit with a small kitchenette and a balcony overlooking the golf course. It was clean and comfortable and utterly impersonal, the kind of space designed to house anyone and therefore belong to no one. The marketing director emphasized the convenience of not having to maintain a house or yard, the security of having medical assistance available around the clock, the social opportunities that would keep me active and engaged with peers who shared similar interests and experiences. What she didn't mention was that everything I'd spent 72 years accumulating would have to be eliminated to fit into this tidy, manageable space. The books Robert and I had collected, the furniture we'd chosen together, the garden tools and kitchen equipment and decades of photographs documenting a life we'd built from nothing. All of it would have to be sorted and sold and donated to, make room for the simplified existence they were offering. On the drive home, Michael and Sarah discussed the tour with the satisfaction of people who'd found exactly what they were looking for. They talked about the cleanliness of the facilities, the qualifications of the staff, the comprehensive nature of the services offered. They compared Sunset Manor favorably to other retirement communities they'd researched, noting the reasonable costs and excellent reputation and convenient location close enough for regular visits, but far enough away to feel like a fresh start. They asked what I thought, but in the way people ask when they've already decided and just want confirmation that you're not going to be difficult about their decision. I said it seemed very nice, which was true but incomplete. It was nice in the way hotels are nice, comfortable and efficient and utterly forgettable. It was nice in the way that eliminated personality and history and all the messy complications that make a place feel like home rather than just shelter. The realtor came to the house the following week, an energetic woman named Patricia who walked through my home with a tablet and a measuring tape, calculating square footage and noting updates that would be needed to maximize market value. She moved through rooms I'd lived in for decades with the clinical efficiency of someone appraising assets rather than viewing a life, pointing out features that would appeal to buyers and problems that might need addressing before listing. Michael and Sarah followed Patricia from room to room, taking notes and asking questions about pricing strategies and market conditions and how quickly we could expect the house to sell. They discussed my belongings as if they were obstacles to be cleared rather than possessions with meaning and history. Patricia suggested staging the house with neutral furniture and removing personal items that might distract potential buyers from envisioning their own lives in the space. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom Robert and I had shared for 35 years, listening to them debate whether the hardwood floors needed refinishing and whether the master bathroom would benefit from updating. They talked about return on investment and comparable sales and market positioning, while I tried to imagine strangers sleeping in the bed where Robert had died, cooking in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals, sitting on the patio, where we'd watched Arizona sunsets and planned our retirement and dreamed about growing old together. Patricia estimated the house would sell quickly in the current market, probably within 60 days if we priced it competitively and made a few cosmetic improvements. She handed Michael a folder containing her marketing plan and suggested we schedule a follow-up meeting once I'd had time to consider her recommendations. She shook my hand and complimented me on maintaining the property so well, as if I'd been preparing it for sale rather than simply living in it as my home. After she left, Michael and Sarah stayed to discuss next steps. They wanted to begin decluttering. Immediately, sorting through my possessions to determine what would fit in the retirement community apartment and what would need to be donated or discarded. They talked about renting a storage unit for items that might have sentimental value but wouldn't be practical in my new living situation, as if sentimentality were a luxury that could be rationed and stored, rather than an essential part of what made life worth living. Sarah volunteered to help with the sorting, bringing her teacher's organizational skills to the project of reducing my life to fit inside predetermined boundaries. She talked about making the process fun, about discovering treasures we'd forgotten and creating memory books with photographs of items we couldn't keep. She approached the dismantling of my home like a creative project, something that could be made enjoyable through proper attitude and systematic planning. They scheduled weekend sessions for going through closets and cabinets, for sorting through Robert's tools and workshop supplies, for deciding what to do with furniture that wouldn't fit in a one-bedroom apartment. They created categories for keeping, donating, selling, and storing, as if 40 years of accumulated possessions could be efficiently processed through predetermined channels without considering why we'd kept these things in the first place or what they represented in the context of a shared life. I found myself agreeing to their timeline because resistance felt pointless and ungrateful. They were volunteering their time to help with a process they saw as necessary and beneficial, and my reluctance appeared selfish and unreasonable in the face of their obvious good intentions. They were solving my problems and securing my future, and relieving me of burdens I hadn't realized I was carrying. So my lack of enthusiasm seemed petty and counterproductive. The sorting sessions began the following Saturday morning, with Sarah arriving early with coffee and pastries and the kind of determined cheerfulness that makes resistance feel churlish. She'd brought boxes and labels and trash bags, along with a systematic approach that would ensure we made steady progress through each room without getting overwhelmed by emotional attachments or unnecessary sentimentality. She was efficient and thorough and completely immune to the significance of items that had shaped my daily life for decades. We started with the guest bedroom, which Sarah considered the easiest place to begin because it contained the fewest personal items and the lowest emotional stakes. She went through closets filled with linens and seasonal decorations, holding up items and asking whether I really needed 3 sets of holiday dishes or 6 winter coats or boxes of Christmas ornaments that I used once a year. She made practical arguments about space limitations and maintenance requirements, about the futility of keeping things I rarely used just because they'd once seemed important. I watched her sort through Robert's clothes, which I'd never had the courage to donate, handling his shirts and jackets with the efficient detachment of someone processing inventory rather than touching items that still held the shape of the man I'd loved. She folded everything neatly into donation boxes, commenting on the good quality of his work clothes and suggesting that someone would surely appreciate having such sturdy, well-maintained garments. She approached Robert's workshop the same way, sorting through tools and hardware and half-finished projects with systematic thoroughness that ignored the stories behind each accumulation. The wooden birdhouse he'd never completed, the extra hinges he'd saved from kitchen cabinet repairs, the coffee cans filled with screws and nails organized by size and purpose, all of it went into boxes marked for donation or disposal without consideration of the careful attention that had created such orderly collections. Michael handled the heavier items, carrying boxes to his truck and making multiple trips to Goodwill and the recycling center. He worked with the focused efficiency of someone checking items off a list, completing tasks without getting distracted by memories or attachments. He dismantled Robert's workbench and loaded it into the truck alongside tools that represented decades of weekend projects and household repairs, treating them like surplus equipment rather than extensions of his father's hands and interests. Each session eliminated another layer of my life, another connection to the routines and possessions that had defined my daily existence. The kitchen utensils I'd used to cook thousands of meals, the books I'd collected and planned to reread, the photographs documenting family vacations and holiday celebrations, all of it was evaluated for its utility in a smaller space and found wanting. Sarah photographed items before donating them, creating digital records of possessions we were eliminating, as if pictures could substitute for presence or memory could be preserved through documentation. They worked with such systematic determination that I began to feel like an observer at the dismantling of someone else's life. They made decisions about my possessions based on space constraints and practical considerations, sorting through accumulations that represented decades of choices and preferences and reducing them to categories of useful or dispensable. They talked about the freedom I'd gain from owning fewer things, about the relief of not having to dust and organize and maintain so many possessions, about the simplicity that would result from living with only essential items. What they didn't understand was that these possessions weren't burdens to be eliminated, but connections to be preserved. The ceramic vase Robert had bought me at a roadside stand during our anniversary trip to Sedona, the cookbook I'd inherited from my mother, with her handwritten notes in the margins, the quilt my grandmother had made that didn't match any decorating scheme but held warmth that went beyond temperature. All of these items carried meaning that couldn't be measured by their utility or replaced by their photographs. The sessions continued every weekend for a month, each one eliminating another room's worth of accumulations and attachments. My house grew progressively emptier and more impersonal, beginning to resemble the staged properties Patricia had recommended, rather than the home Robert and I had created together. The walls showed pale rectangles where pictures had hung, the shelves stood empty of books and decorative items, the closets contained only essential clothing and linens determined appropriate for apartment living. Michael and Sarah expressed satisfaction with our progress, noting how much more spacious and manageable the house felt without unnecessary clutter and redundant possessions. They talked about how much easier it would be to clean and maintain, how much less overwhelming it would be to live with only items that served clear purposes or brought genuine joy. They approached the transformation like a successful home improvement project, proud of their efficiency and pleased with the results of their systematic approach. I walked through increasingly empty rooms that no longer felt like mine, touching surfaces that had been cleared of the small accumulations that made a space feel lived in rather than simply occupied. The house was cleaner and more organized than it had been in years, but it was also hollow, stripped of the layered evidence that people had built a life there rather than simply existed in designated square footage. They scheduled my move to Sunset Manor for the first week of December, allowing time for the house to be staged and listed, and for me to adjust to the idea of institutional living before the holidays brought additional emotional complications. They talked about the timing as strategic, about beginning the new year in a new place with new opportunities for social connection and personal growth. They made it sound like an adventure, rather than an exile, a positive choice rather than a surrender to their vision of appropriate senior living. The deposit had already been paid, the contract had been signed, the apartment had been reserved. My transition from independence to supervised living had been arranged with the same systematic efficiency they'd applied to sorting through my possessions, and my role remained what it had been throughout the entire process: passive compliance, with decisions made by people who believed they knew what was best for me better than I knew myself. The Tuesday dinner at Romano's that changed everything started like all the others, with me arriving 15 minutes early and settling into our usual corner booth with a book and a glass of ice water. The restaurant hummed with its familiar evening energy, servers weaving between tables carrying steaming plates, Couples leaning across small tables in intimate conversation, families celebrating birthdays and anniversaries, and the simple pleasure of eating someone else's cooking. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that morning, a navy dress with pearl buttons that Robert had always admired, paired with the silver bracelet Michael had given me for my 70th birthday. I felt presentable, dignified, like the woman I'd always been, rather than the aging problem I'd apparently become in their eyes. I was looking forward to dinner, hoping that maybe tonight we could talk about something other than my limitations and their solutions, something that reminded us we were family rather than caseworkers and client. Michael and Sarah arrived 25 minutes late, not the usual few minutes that could be blamed on traffic, but genuinely late in a way that suggested I hadn't been important enough to prioritize. They slid into the booth across from me with distracted apologies and immediate attention to their phones, checking messages and responding to emails while I sat quietly waiting for them to finish conducting business that was apparently more urgent than family time. Sarah looked polished and professional in a way that made me feel suddenly outdated. Her hair perfectly styled and her makeup applied with the precision of someone who spent her days being observed by students and parents and administrators. Michael wore a button-down shirt I didn't recognize, probably something she'd bought him to replace the casual clothes he'd always preferred. They looked like successful adults, competent and confident, people who managed their lives with the kind of strategic planning that left no room for inefficiency or sentiment. When they finally put away their phones and focused on me, something in their attention felt different, more intense and purposeful than usual. They asked about my week, with the careful politeness of people conducting an interview, rather than the casual interest of family members catching up. They listened to my answers with the kind of focused attention that suggested they were gathering information rather than simply enjoying my company. Sarah ordered wine for the table without asking what I preferred. A bottle of something never heard of that came with an explanation from the server about grape varieties and vintage characteristics. I would have been happy with the house red I usually ordered, but she seemed to think the evening called for something more sophisticated, something that matched whatever significance she'd assigned to this particular dinner. The conversation during appetizers followed familiar patterns, updates about their work and questions about my health, and gentle inquiries about how I was adjusting to the changes we'd been making together. But underneath the routine exchange, I sensed anticipation, as if they were building towards something important that required careful preparation and strategic timing. They exchanged glances that suggested coordination, little looks that indicated they'd discussed what came next and were waiting for the right moment to proceed. Michael seemed nervous in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, trying to explain why he'd missed curfew or forgotten an important obligation. He fidgeted with his napkin and checked his watch repeatedly and kept glancing at Sarah as if seeking permission or encouragement to begin whatever conversation they'd planned. Sarah appeared more composed, but her composure felt rehearsed, like an actress who'd memorized her lines but was still uncertain about her performance. When the main courses arrived, Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder thick with papers and brochures. She placed it on the table beside her plate with the ceremonial care of someone unveiling an important document, then smiled at me with the kind of bright enthusiasm that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. She said they'd been doing research, that they'd found something they thought would be perfect for me, that they'd taken the liberty of making some preliminary arrangements. The folder contained detailed information about Desert Winds Assisted Living, a facility in Tempe that specialized in memory care and comprehensive health services for seniors with complex medical needs. The brochures featured photographs of smiling elderly people participating in supervised activities, eating meals in a communal dining room, receiving assistance from uniformed staff members who looked young enough to be their great-grandchildren. Sarah explained that Desert Winds offered a higher level of care than Sunset Manor, with medical professionals on staff 24 hours a day and specialized programs for residents who needed more support than traditional independent living could provide. She talked about the peace of mind this would bring, knowing that trained professionals would be monitoring my health and responding to any emergencies that might arise. ensuring that I would never face a medical crisis alone or without immediate expert intervention. Michael nodded along with her presentation, occasionally interjecting comments about the facility's excellent reputation and convenient location and the comprehensive nature of the services they provided. He talked about visiting other families who'd made similar decisions, about how grateful they were to have found such high-quality care for their loved ones, about the relief that came with knowing their parents were safe and well-supervised. They'd already toured the facility without me. They'd met with the admissions coordinator, reviewed the contracts, discussed the financial arrangements, and put my name on a waiting list that had recently had an opening. They'd scheduled another tour for the following week, this time including me, so I could see firsthand the quality of the accommodations and the professionalism of the staff, and the comprehensive nature of the programs designed to meet my evolving needs. The timeline was aggressive, driven by the availability of a corner room with large windows and an attached bathroom that the facility director had held specifically for us. If we moved quickly, I could be settled in my new accommodations within 3 weeks, well before the holidays brought additional stress and complications to an already challenging transition. They'd coordinated with the retirement community to cancel my reservation at Sunset Manor, negotiating a partial refund of the deposit, and transferring my place on the waiting list to someone who needed less comprehensive care. I sat there listening to them describe a future they'd planned without consulting me, watching Sarah point to photographs of residents receiving assistance with daily activities that I still managed independently. They showed me pictures of people being helped to dress and bathe and eat, people whose cognitive abilities had declined to the point where they needed supervision and guidance for tasks I performed automatically every day. The assisted living facility looked pleasant enough, with cheerful common areas and well-maintained grounds and staff members who smiled warmly in every promotional photograph. But it was designed for people who could no longer care for themselves, people whose families had made difficult decisions about safety and supervision and the kind of comprehensive support that becomes necessary when independence is no longer safe or practical. I tried to interrupt their presentation, to ask questions about why they thought I needed this level of care, to understand what had happened to change their assessment of my capabilities so dramatically. But they talked over my questions, dismissing my concerns as natural resistance to change, inevitable anxiety about transitioning to a new environment, understandable reluctance to acknowledge declining abilities that I might not recognize in myself. Sarah pulled out a checklist she'd printed from a website about warning signs that indicated when seniors needed more support than they could manage alone. She read through items about memory problems and difficulty with household tasks and social isolation, checking off boxes that supposedly described my current situation. According to her assessment, I showed multiple indicators of someone who would benefit from professional oversight and structured support services. Michael supported her evaluation with examples of things he'd noticed during recent visits, small incidents that he'd interpreted as evidence of declining cognitive function and diminishing ability to manage independent living safely. The time. I'd forgotten to turn off the garden hose, the grocery list I'd lost and had to rewrite, the slight confusion I'd shown when the bank had changed their online system and I'd needed help accessing my account. They presented these minor lapses as symptoms of a larger pattern, proof that I was struggling more than I wanted to admit and needed more help than I was willing to accept. They talked about my situation with the kind of gentle firmness that parents use when explaining difficult decisions to children who lack the maturity to understand complex situations requiring adult judgment and intervention. The conversation continued around me while I struggled to process what was happening, to understand how ordinary moments of forgetfulness had been transformed into evidence of incompetence, how normal aging had been redefined as disability requiring institutional management. They talked about my future as if my input were irrelevant, as if my preferences were symptoms rather than valid choices made by a competent adult. Sarah mentioned that she'd already spoken with my doctor about the transition, discussing my medical, history, and current health status to ensure that Desert Winds would be prepared to meet my needs from the moment I arrived. She'd obtained copies of my medical records and prescription information, coordinating with the facility's healthcare team to ensure continuity of care and appropriate monitoring of my chronic conditions. This revelation stunned me more than anything else they'd said. My medical information was private, protected by laws that required my explicit consent before anyone could access or share details about my health status. Yet Sarah had somehow convinced my doctor to discuss my care with her, to provide information that should have been confidential, to participate in planning my future without my knowledge or permission. When I asked how she'd obtained access to my medical records, Sarah explained that she'd used the healthcare power of attorney that I'd signed years earlier, when Robert was dying, and I'd needed someone to help coordinate his care and communicate with doctors during the crisis of his final illness. I'd forgotten about that document, signed in desperation during the worst period of my life, when I'd been grateful for any help managing the overwhelming complexity of terminal care. She'd kept that power of attorney, filed it with my doctor's office and the hospital, maintaining legal authority over my medical decisions that I'd never formally revoked. She presented this as evidence of her caring and foresight, her commitment to ensuring my health and safety, even when I might not recognize the need for intervention or assistance. Michael supported her actions with explanations about their responsibility to protect me from my own poor judgment, their obligation to ensure my safety even when I resisted their help, their duty to make difficult decisions that I might be too proud or stubborn to make for myself. They talked about love requiring hard choices, about caring meaning sometimes overriding someone's stated preferences in favor of their actual needs. The dinner continued with them outlining logistics for the transition, discussing timelines and arrangements and the practical details of moving me from independent living to supervised care. They'd contacted a service that specialized in senior relocations, professionals who would handle the sorting and packing and coordinating that would be required to move me into a much smaller space designed for someone with limited possessions and restricted activities. Most of my remaining belongings would need to be disposed of, since assisted living residents were allowed only personal items that fit within strict space limitations and safety guidelines. The furniture I'd carefully chosen for my apartment at Sunset Manor would be inappropriate for a care facility, where all furnishings were provided, and personal decorations were limited to a few small items that wouldn't interfere with medical equipment or emergency procedures. They'd already arranged for an estate sale company to handle the disposal of everything that wouldn't fit in my new accommodations. Professionals who would price and display and sell the accumulations of my lifetime to strangers who would evaluate my possessions based on their retail value rather than their personal significance. The proceeds would be added to my care fund, helping offset the substantial monthly costs of assisted living services. Sarah handed me a thick packet of forms that needed to be completed before admission, documents that authorized the facility to make medical decisions on my behalf, to monitor my activities and restrict my movements, to control my access to money and medications and communication with the outside world. The papers included releases that absolved the facility of liability for injuries or incidents that might occur during my residence, agreements that gave them authority to determine my level of care and modify my living arrangements based on their assessment of my changing needs. The admission packet also contained a list of prohibited items, possessions that wouldn't be allowed in my new accommodations because they posed safety risks or didn't align with the facility's policies. Candles, extension cords, kitchen appliances, medications not approved by their medical staff, any objects that could be construed as weapons or used for self-harm, all of these were banned from the controlled environment where I would be living. Reading through the restrictions felt like reviewing the rules for a minimum security prison, rather than the guidelines for a home where I would be spending my remaining years. Every aspect of daily life would be regulated, from when I could eat to where I could go to whom I could see and when I could see them. My autonomy would be replaced by supervision, my independence traded for safety, my privacy eliminated in favor of professional oversight. I looked up from the papers to find Michael and Sarah watching me with expressions of satisfied concern pleased with themselves for having solved the problem of my declining capabilities and uncertain future. They'd arranged everything with the efficiency of people accustomed to managing complex projects, coordinating multiple service providers to ensure smooth execution of their carefully developed plan. The server approached our table to offer dessert, but I couldn't imagine eating anything sweet while processing the bitter reality of what my family had arranged for me. My throat felt tight, my hands were shaking slightly, and my vision seemed somehow dimmer than it had been when I'd arrived at the restaurant looking forward to an evening of family connection and casual conversation. That's when the true weight of their betrayal hit me. Not just the practical arrangements they'd made without my consent, but the fundamental disrespect they'd shown for my right to make decisions about my own life. They'd used legal documents I'd signed during a crisis to override my current preferences. They'd manipulated medical professionals into sharing confidential information. They'd made irreversible commitments on my behalf without considering whether their vision of my future aligned with my own desires and values. I excused myself to use the restroom, but instead I stood in the narrow hallway near the back of the restaurant, gripping the wall and trying to catch my breath. Through the doorway, I could see them at our table, Michael signing papers Sarah had brought, both of them looking relieved and accomplished, like people who'd successfully completed a difficult but necessary task. When I returned to the table, they were ready to leave. Sarah had organized her folder, and Michael had handled the check, and they were both reaching for their coats with the efficient movements of people who'd accomplished their objective. They hugged me in the parking lot with the satisfied affection of people who'd done something loving and difficult, people who'd made hard choices for someone they cared about, who lacked the judgment to make appropriate decisions independently. I stood there watching their taillights disappear into the Phoenix traffic, still holding the folder containing forms that would transfer control of my life to strangers who would manage my daily existence according to institutional protocols rather than personal preferences. The desert air felt cool against my face, and the parking lot was nearly empty except for my car and a few others belonging to restaurant staff finishing their evening shift. That's when I realized they hadn't just planned my future, they'd planned my surrender. The assisted living facility wasn't a home. It was a holding facility where I would wait to die under professional supervision, where my remaining years would be managed by people who saw me as a collection of medical conditions and safety risks rather than a person with preferences and desires and the right to determine how she wanted to live. I sat in my car for a long time, not ready to drive home to a house that was already sold, not ready to face the reality that my family had systematically eliminated every aspect of my independence while convincing themselves they were acting out of love and concern. I thought about the assisted living facility brochure, about the photographs of elderly people being helped with basic tasks I still performed without difficulty, about the institutional environment where my autonomy would be replaced by professional oversight. That's when I pulled out my phone and made the call that would change everything. Not to argue or plead or try to convince them they were wrong about my capabilities, but to take back control of the one thing they couldn't manipulate or manage without my cooperation: my will, my money, my final decisions about how my life's work would be distributed after I was gone. If they wanted to treat me like an incompetent child, they would discover exactly what that choice would cost them. The morning after my late-night meeting with Mr. Thompson, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The Arizona sunrise painted my bedroom walls in soft gold, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I was waking up in my own life rather than someone else's version of what my life should be. I made coffee in the kitchen that still belonged to me, at least for a few more weeks, and began implementing the plan that would quietly dismantle every assumption Michael and Sarah had made about their control over my future. My first call was to Dr. Martinez, my physician of 30 years, a woman who'd seen me through pregnancies and menopause and Robert's final illness. When I asked to schedule an appointment to discuss my medical records and healthcare directives, she seemed surprised but agreed to see me that afternoon. I didn't mention Sarah's unauthorized access to my information, not yet. but I made it clear that I needed to review and update my healthcare authorization immediately. While I waited for the appointment, I began the systematic process of reclaiming control over every aspect of my life that Michael and Sarah had gradually assumed authority over. I called my bank and requested copies of all recent account activity, particularly any transactions or inquiries that had been made by anyone other than me. The customer service representative was helpful and professional, explaining their procedures for protecting customer privacy and ensuring that only authorized individuals could access account information. What I discovered was troubling, but not entirely surprising. Sarah had been using her healthcare power of attorney as identification to gain access to my financial information, claiming she needed to verify my ability to pay for medical expenses and long-term care services. She'd obtained copies of my account statements, investment summaries, and even details about my insurance policies, building a comprehensive picture of my financial situation without my knowledge or explicit consent. The bank representative apologized for the unauthorized disclosure and immediately flagged my accounts to prevent future access by anyone other than me. She explained that healthcare powers of attorney were often misinterpreted by well-meaning family members who didn't understand the legal limitations of such documents, and that banks sometimes erred on the side of providing information when families claimed medical emergencies or urgent care coordination needs. I requested new account numbers and updated security protocols that would require multiple forms of identification and verbal confirmation of my identity before any information could be shared. The process would take a few days to complete, but it would ensure that my financial privacy was protected and that no one could make inquiries or transactions without my explicit authorization. Next, I contacted my insurance companies, both health and life insurance, to review my beneficiary designations and ensure that no unauthorized changes had been made to my policies. The health insurance representative confirmed that Sarah had contacted them multiple times, requesting information about my coverage and inquiring about benefits for assisted living and memory care services. While they hadn't provided specific details about my coverage, they had sent general information about senior care benefits that Sarah had used to support her arguments about my need for institutional services. The life insurance company had more concerning news. Someone had submitted a change of beneficiary form, attempting to add Sarah as a secondary beneficiary with rights to receive information about my policy status and claims procedures. The form hadn't been processed because it lacked my notarized signature, but it had been filed and was under review when I called to inquire about my account status. I immediately revoked any pending changes and updated my beneficiary information to reflect my new estate planning decisions. The insurance representative was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions to confirm my identity and ensure that I was making these changes voluntarily and with full understanding of their implications. She also flagged my account to prevent future unauthorized change requests and established additional security measures that would require in-person verification for any modifications to my policies. My appointment with Dr. Martinez that afternoon was illuminating and infuriating in equal measure. She confirmed that Sarah had contacted her office multiple times, initially claiming urgent concerns about my health and safety that required immediate medical consultation. Sarah had presented herself as my designated healthcare advocate and had requested detailed information about my mental status, cognitive function, and ability to live independently. Dr. Martinez admitted that she'd been concerned about my well-being, based on Sarah's descriptions of my behavior, and had agreed to discuss my case with her as my authorized healthcare representative. However, she emphasized that her conversations with Sarah had been general in nature, focused on providing guidance about warning signs to watch for and resources available for families dealing with aging-related challenges. What disturbed me most was learning that Sarah had misrepresented our conversations to Dr. Martinez, claiming that I'd expressed confusion about my medications, forgotten important appointments, and demonstrated other signs of cognitive decline that suggested I might need more supervised care. These were fabrications, distortions of normal senior moments that everyone experiences. but Sarah had presented them as evidence of declining mental capacity that required professional intervention. Dr. Martinez reviewed my medical records with me, confirming that my recent test results showed no signs of dementia or significant cognitive impairment. My blood pressure was well controlled, my cholesterol levels were within normal ranges, and my overall health was excellent for someone my age. There was no medical justification for the level of supervised care that Sarah had been advocating, no documented evidence of the declining capabilities she'd described to support her arguments about my need for institutional placement. I requested copies of all communications Sarah had had with the medical office and formally revoked her healthcare power of attorney, replacing it with the new directives Mr. Thompson and I had prepared. Dr. Martinez was understanding and supportive, apologizing for any confusion that had resulted from Sarah's misrepresentations and assuring me that my medical information would be carefully protected going forward. She also provided me with written documentation of my current health status and cognitive function, official medical records that contradicted Sarah's claims about my declining abilities and need for supervised care. These documents would be essential if Michael and Sarah attempted to challenge my legal changes or claimed that I lacked the mental capacity to make informed decisions about my own life. Over the next several days, I systematically contacted every service provider and institution that Michael and Sarah had involved in their planning for my future. The assisted living facility, the estate sale company, the senior relocation service, the real estate agent handling my house sale, all of them received calls from me personally, clarifying my status and correcting misinformation they'd been given about my situation and preferences. The conversation with Desert Winds Assisted Living was particularly revealing. The admissions coordinator seemed surprised to hear from me directly, since all previous communications had been handled by Michael and Sarah. She confirmed that they'd completed an extensive application process on my behalf, including medical, evaluations and financial assessments that painted a picture of someone who needed immediate placement in supervised care. When I asked to review the application they'd submitted, I discovered a document filled with exaggerations and misrepresentations about my health status, living situation, and support needs. They'd described me as socially isolated, cognitively, declining, and struggling with activities of daily living that I performed without difficulty. They'd listed medications I wasn't taking, medical conditions I didn't have, and functional limitations that existed only in their imagination. The facility had based their acceptance of my application on false information provided by people who claimed to be acting in my best interests, but were actually manipulating the system to force me into an institutional setting I neither wanted nor needed. I formally withdrew my application and requested that all documentation be returned or destroyed, making it clear that I had never authorized the application process and did not consent to placement at their facility. The estate sale company had similar revelations. Michael and Sarah had provided them with detailed inventories of my possessions, photographs of rooms and furniture, and timelines for conducting sales of items they claimed I could no longer manage or accommodate in my downsized living situation. They'd scheduled appraisers to evaluate valuable items, and had even discussed pricing strategies for moving inventory quickly to meet their aggressive timeline for emptying my house. I canceled all services and demanded the return of any materials they'd collected about my possessions. The company representatives were professional, but clearly confused about the situation, since they'd understood that the estate sale was being arranged by my family to help me transition to a care facility. When I explained that I had not authorized these services and did not plan to dispose of my belongings, they quickly canceled their contracts and apologized for any inconvenience. The real estate situation was more complex because contracts had been signed and deposits had been exchanged. However, my attorney had anticipated this complication and had included provisions in my updated legal documents that gave me authority to cancel or modify real estate transactions if they'd been arranged without my fully informed consent. The process would be complicated and potentially expensive, but it was legally possible to withdraw from the sale if I was willing to pay penalties and legal fees. I decided to proceed with canceling the house sale, despite the financial costs involved. The house was my home, the place where Robert and I had built our life together, and I wasn't ready to abandon it simply because Michael and Sarah thought I should live somewhere more convenient for their oversight. The buyers were disappointed, but understanding when my attorney explained that the original agreement had been made under circumstances that didn't reflect my actual wishes or intentions. Throughout this process, I maintained absolute secrecy about my activities. Michael and Sarah continued to call regularly, checking on my adjustment to the idea of assisted living and discussing logistics for my upcoming move. I listened to their plans with neutral responses, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, simply acknowledging their information while privately dismantling every arrangement they'd made. They interpreted my subdued responses as acceptance, possibly even relief at having difficult decisions made for me by people who understood my needs better than I did. They talked about the peace of mind that would come with professional supervision, the social opportunities available at Desert Winds, and the security of knowing that medical assistance would always be available if health emergencies arose. I let them maintain their illusions while methodically destroying the infrastructure they'd built around their vision of my future. Every day brought new cancellations, new revocations, new assertions of my autonomy and authority over my own life. I felt like a spy operating behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and conducting sabotage operations while maintaining perfect cover as the compliant elderly woman they expected me to be. The most satisfying cancellation was the senior relocation service that had been hired to pack and move my belongings into the tiny assisted living room they'd selected for me. The company specialized in helping elderly people transition from houses to apartments or care facilities, and they'd developed efficient systems for sorting possessions into categories of keep, donate, or discard, based on space limitations and institutional regulations. When I called to cancel their services, the coordinator expressed concern about the timing, since they'd already scheduled crews and reserved equipment for my move date. She asked if I wanted to postpone rather than cancel, suggesting that I might simply need more time to adjust emotionally to the reality of leaving my home. Her tone was gentle and understanding, the voice of someone accustomed to dealing with elderly clients who struggled with major life transitions. I politely but firmly explained that I would not be moving to assisted living, that the arrangements had been made without my consent, and that I had no intention of leaving my home or disposing of my possessions. She seemed genuinely surprised, since her contracts were with Michael and Sarah, who'd presented themselves as my authorized representatives, handling necessary arrangements for my care and safety. The conversation highlighted how easily my family had been able to manipulate systems designed to help elderly people simply by presenting themselves as concerned relatives acting in my best interests. Professional service providers had assumed that adult children had authority to make decisions for elderly parents, particularly when those decisions seemed reasonable and were presented as necessary for health and safety reasons. My systematic dismantling of their plans created a puzzle that Michael and Sarah were slow to recognize. Individual cancellations could be explained as administrative errors or scheduling conflicts, but the pattern of revocations and withdrawals eventually became impossible to ignore. When Desert Winds called to confirm my move-in date and learned that my application had been withdrawn, they contacted Michael to clarify the situation. When the real estate agent called to discuss complications with the house sale and learned that I was attempting to cancel the contract, she reached out to Sarah for guidance about how to proceed. When the estate sale company called to reschedule their appraisal visit and learned that their services were no longer needed, they contacted both Michael and Sarah to understand what had changed. Each conversation revealed another piece of my quiet rebellion, another assertion of autonomy that contradicted their assumptions about my compliance and acceptance. They began to realize that their careful planning was unraveling, not because of external obstacles or administrative complications, but because I was actively working to dismantle arrangements they'd made without my genuine consent. The first direct confrontation came when Sarah called me, her voice tight with frustration and confusion, asking why Desert Winds had contacted them about my withdrawn application. I could hear the strain in her tone, the disbelief that I had somehow interfered with arrangements she'd worked so hard to coordinate. She asked if I was having second thoughts about the move, if I needed more time to prepare emotionally, if there was something about the facility that concerned me. I told her simply that I had never agreed to move to assisted living, that I didn't need the level of care they provided, and that I had withdrawn my application because I had no intention of leaving my home. My response was calm and factual, delivered without anger or accusation, but it clearly shocked her. She stammered questions about my mental state, my understanding of my situation, and whether I'd discussed these decisions with anyone who could help me think through the implications. The conversation revealed the depth of their assumption that I lacked the capacity to make informed decisions about my own life. Sarah couldn't comprehend that I had deliberately and systematically dismantled their plans, couldn't accept that. My compliance had been an illusion, couldn't believe that I possessed the knowledge and determination to protect myself from their well-intentioned but unwanted management. When Michael called an hour later, his tone was more confrontational, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, and whether I understood the legal and financial consequences of canceling arrangements that had taken months to coordinate. He accused me of acting irrationally, of making decisions based on fear rather than facts, of jeopardizing my own safety and well-being out of stubborn pride and denial about my changing needs. I listened to his accusations without defending myself, allowing him to reveal the extent of his assumption that my resistance was evidence of cognitive decline rather than competent self-advocacy. He talked about my behavior as symptomatic of the very problems that made supervised care necessary, as proof that I could no longer be trusted to make reasonable decisions about my own welfare. When he finished his lecture, I told him that I would not be moving to assisted living, that I had revoked all authorizations they'd been using to make decisions on my behalf, and that any further arrangements for my care would need to be made with my explicit consent and active participation. I didn't explain how I'd discovered their manipulations or detail the steps I'd taken to protect myself. I simply stated my position and ended the conversation. The quiet war I'd been conducting was no longer quiet. They knew I was fighting back, knew their control was evaporating, knew that their carefully constructed plan for managing my future was collapsing, but they didn't yet understand the full scope of what I'd done, didn't realize that I'd not only reclaimed control over my immediate circumstances, but had also restructured my entire estate to reflect my revised understanding of their character and intentions. That revelation would come soon enough, when Mr. Thompson contacted them about updates to my legal documents, when they discovered that their expected inheritance had been redirected to serve purposes I actually supported, when they learned that their manipulation and control had cost them far more than they'd ever imagined possible. The quiet war was becoming something larger, something that would force them to confront the consequences of treating me like an incompetent burden rather than the competent adult I'd always been. The certified letters arrived at Michael and Sarah's house on a Thursday morning, delivered with the official weight that only legal correspondence carries. Mr. Thompson had timed the delivery perfectly, ensuring they would receive the notifications about my estate planning changes on the same day, preventing any opportunity for coordination or damage control between them. Michael called me within 2 hours of signing for his letter, his voice shaking with a combination of disbelief and rage that I'd never heard before. He demanded to know if the documents were real, if I'd actually changed my will to exclude him entirely, if I understood what I was throwing away by redirecting his inheritance to strangers who would never appreciate the sacrifices he'd made for our family. I confirmed that the documents were authentic and legally binding, that I'd made the changes with full understanding of their implications, and that my decisions reflected my assessment of his character based on his recent treatment of me. When he sputtered protests about his love for me and his good intentions, I reminded him that love doesn't manipulate medical records, and good intentions don't override other people's autonomy. Sarah called an hour later, her teacher's voice crisp with the kind of controlled anger she probably used with misbehaving students. She accused me of being vindictive and petty, of punishing them for caring about my welfare, of making decisions that would ultimately hurt the grandchildren they hoped to give me someday. Her arguments revealed how completely she'd misunderstood the situation, how thoroughly she believed that their control over my life was justified by their concern for my safety. I listened to her litany of accusations without defending myself, allowing her to demonstrate the entitled attitude that had led to this outcome. She talked about the money as if it already belonged to them, about my estate as if it were their retirement fund, about my decisions as if they required her approval. To be valid, her response confirmed that my assessment of their character had been accurate. The revelation about the charitable foundation in Robert's name particularly infuriated them. They couldn't understand why I would give money to educational programs for underprivileged children when my own family had financial needs and future plans that could benefit from that inheritance. They talked about my donations as if they were theft, as if I were stealing from them by choosing to support causes that reflected my values, rather than simply enriching people who demonstrated their unwillingness to respect my autonomy. Michael threatened to contest the will, claiming that I'd been manipulated by my attorney or influenced by people who wanted to steal his rightful inheritance. He insisted that my recent behavior proved I wasn't mentally competent to make such dramatic changes to my estate planning, that a court would surely recognize that I'd been coerced or confused into making decisions that went against my family's interests. I reminded him that I had comprehensive medical documentation of my mental competence, that multiple professionals had evaluated my cognitive function and found no impairment, and that any legal challenge would require him to prove that caring about seniors' rights and educational opportunities was evidence of insanity. His threats rang hollow when measured against the thorough preparation Mr. Thompson and I had done to protect my decisions from exactly this kind of challenge. Sarah's response was more calculating, focused on damage control and negotiation rather than direct confrontation. She suggested that we could work together to find a compromise, perhaps reinstating a portion of their inheritance in exchange for their agreement to respect my independence and stop pursuing unwanted care arrangements. She offered to sign legal documents guaranteeing that they would never again attempt to force me into assisted living or make medical decisions without my consent. Her willingness to negotiate revealed that she understood the permanence of what I'd done, that she recognized their complete loss of leverage in our relationship. But her offer also demonstrated that she still didn't grasp the fundamental principle at stake, which wasn't about specific arrangements or future promises, but about basic respect for my dignity and autonomy as a human being. I declined her offer to negotiate, explaining that respect couldn't be purchased and dignity couldn't be restored through legal agreements. The changes I'd made weren't punishments that could be reversed through good behavior. They were consequences of choices they'd already made about how to treat me. Their inheritance had been redirected because they'd proven themselves unworthy of it, and no future promises could change that assessment. The weeks following the notification brought a parade of intermediaries, family friends and distant relatives who'd been recruited to convince me to reconsider my decisions. Each conversation followed the same pattern, with well-meaning people expressing concern about family relationships and suggesting that I was being too harsh in my response to what they characterized as loving but misguided attempts to ensure my welfare. These interventions revealed how effectively Michael and Sarah had presented their side of the story, portraying themselves as devoted children who'd made difficult decisions to protect an aging mother who couldn't recognize her own declining capabilities. They'd crafted a narrative that made them appear selfless and caring, while casting me as confused and ungrateful, someone whose stubborn pride was preventing her from accepting necessary help. I responded to each intermediary with the same calm explanation of the facts, describing the unauthorized access to my medical records, the manipulated care arrangements, the systematic elimination of my choices about my own future. Some of these conversations resulted in understanding and support for my position, while others ended with awkward acknowledgments that family situations were complex and outsiders couldn't fully understand all the factors involved. The attempted interventions gradually diminished as people realized that I wasn't confused or manipulated, but was instead a competent adult who'd made informed decisions about consequences for unacceptable behavior. The narrative that Michael and Sarah had constructed began to crumble as more details emerged about their methods and motivations, as people understood that their concern had crossed the line into controlling manipulation. 3 months after the legal notifications were delivered, Michael and Sarah made one final attempt at reconciliation, requesting a meeting at Romano's Italian Bistro to discuss our family situation and explore possibilities for rebuilding our relationship. I agreed to meet them, curious about what approach they would take now that all their leverage had disappeared and their financial incentives had been eliminated. They arrived promptly and appeared subdued, dressed more casually than usual, and carrying themselves with less of the confident authority that had characterized their previous interactions with me. Sarah looked tired, older somehow, while Michael seemed deflated in a way that reminded me of the boy he'd been when forced to confront the consequences of poor choices. The conversation was awkward but necessary, with both of them offering apologies for their handling of my care situation and acknowledging that they'd overstepped appropriate boundaries in their efforts to ensure my safety. They claimed to have learned from the experience, to better understand my perspective, and to recognize that their approach had been controlling rather than supportive. I listened to their apologies without rushing to forgive, allowing them to experience the discomfort of uncertain relationships and unclear futures. They asked tentative questions about the possibility of restoring some portion of their inheritance, about whether my estate planning decisions were permanent, about what they could do to repair the damage their behavior had caused to our family, relationships. I explained that the financial changes were irreversible, that trust once broken couldn't be simply restored through words, and that any future relationship between us would need to be built on genuine respect for my autonomy rather than assumptions about their authority over my life. I didn't slam the door on eventual reconciliation, but I made it clear that such reconciliation would require fundamental changes in their attitudes and behavior. The dinner ended without dramatic declarations or emotional scenes, simply with acknowledgement that our relationship had been permanently altered by their choices and my responses. They left understanding that I would continue living independently in my own home, making my own decisions about my care and my future, and that any role they played in my life would be determined by their willingness to respect my dignity and autonomy. 6 months later, I'm still in the house Robert and I built together, still managing my own affairs, still proving daily that independence at 72 doesn't require supervision or institutional care. I tend the garden he planted, cook meals in the kitchen we designed, and sleep in the bedroom where we shared 40 years of conversations about dreams and fears and the ordinary moments that accumulate into an extraordinary life. The charitable foundation in Robert's name has begun its work, funding educational programs that give underprivileged children opportunities we never had, and supporting medical research that might prevent other families from facing the loss we endured. My money serves purposes I believe in, rather than simply enriching people who prove themselves unworthy of such trust. Michael and Sarah send occasional cards on holidays and my birthday, polite gestures that acknowledge our continued relationship while respecting the boundaries I've established. They've stopped making suggestions about my living arrangements, stopped offering unwanted assistance with my daily activities, stopped treating my preferences as obstacles to be overcome rather than choices to be honored. Some evenings, as I sit on the patio watching Arizona sunsets paint the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I think about the dinner at Romano's that changed everything, not because I planned for it to become a turning point, but because it revealed truths about respect and autonomy that I could no longer ignore. They left me sitting alone at that table like I didn't matter, so I made sure they understood exactly how much that choice would cost them. The breadbasket is still there when I visit Romano's alone now, still holding more than just bread, still reminding me that ordinary moments can contain extraordinary revelations about who people really are. when they think no one is watching their true character. I learned that night that being family doesn't guarantee respect, that good intentions don't justify controlling behavior, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who understand you least. But I also learned that dignity isn't something other people give you or take away. It's something you claim for yourself, something you protect through your choices and defend through your actions. At 72, I discovered that it's never too late to fight for respect, never too late to demand autonomy, and never too late to ensure that your life serves your values rather than other people's convenience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.